My husband called me replaceable in front of 12 people. Board members, investors, our children.
This report is irrelevant.
I
We're
still
moving forward
remember the
without
way
it.
Grant Owens
But the
leaned back in
projections
his leather
show.
chair
Enough.
and smiled while I stood there holding the financial report he hadn't even bothered to read. "This company survives because people know how to adapt," he said coldly. "No one here is irreplaceable. Not even you, Teagan." The room went silent. 35 years of marriage. 35 years helping him build Owens Harvest Foods from a tiny warehouse in Ohio into a national company. And somehow, I was the replaceable one. I looked at my husband for a long moment and said nothing. Because by then, I already knew something he didn't. The next morning, I walked into that same boardroom as the new CEO. Before I tell you how everything changed overnight, I'd really love to hear from you. Have you ever given your whole life to someone, only to realize they stopped seeing your value? If this story already touched something in your heart, please like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I always read them late at night with a cup of tea beside me. People like to believe companies are built by visionaries. Men in expensive suits. Men giving speeches under bright lights. Men whose names end up on magazine covers. But companies like Owens Harvest Foods are usually built by invisible women. Women who stay awake at 2 a.m. calculating payroll while everyone else sleeps. Women who quietly mortgage jewelry their mothers left them so employees can still get Christmas bonuses during bad years. Women who hold entire families together while pretending they're just helping. That woman was me. When I met Grant Owens in the summer of 1987, he was charming in a dangerous kind of way. The kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with everyone laughing 5 minutes later. He worked in wholesale produce sales back then, wearing cheap ties and impossible confidence. I was studying accounting at Cleveland State while helping my father run his small food distribution warehouse outside Akron. Grant used to say he fell in love with me because I was the only woman smart enough to scare him. Back then, I thought that was romantic. Now, I realize it was a warning. The first years of our marriage were hard enough to break most couples. We lived in a tiny apartment above a laundromat where the pipes screamed every winter. Some nights, we ate canned soup for dinner because we couldn't afford anything else. But those were also the years I loved him most. Grant dreamed big. I made those dreams survivable. When he wanted to launch Owens Harvest Foods, everyone told him it would fail. The food packaging industry was brutal. We had no investors, no connections, and barely enough savings to buy secondhand equipment. So, I stepped in quietly. I built the bookkeeping system by hand. I negotiated with suppliers. I convinced local grocery stores to take a chance on us. I handled taxes, payroll contracts, insurance inventory shipping schedules, and employee disputes. Grant handled the handshakes. I handled everything else. There were nights he'd fall asleep on the couch after giving presentations all day, while I stayed at the kitchen table until dawn, balancing numbers with a calculator and coffee gone cold. And I never complained. Not once. Because back then, it still felt like we were building something together. When our daughter Madeline was born, I brought her to the warehouse in a little carrier beside my desk. I used to rock her with one foot while typing invoices. 2 years later, Ethan arrived. That was when things began changing. Not all at once. Slowly. Dangerously slowly. The company finally started making real money in the late 90s. Regional grocery chains picked us up. Then national contracts followed. Grant became obsessed with growth. He also became obsessed with appearances. Suddenly, he needed tailored suits, luxury watches, country club memberships, professional photographers for business magazines. He stopped introducing me as my partner. I became my wife. At first, I ignored it. Marriage changes people, I told myself. Success changes people too. But the distance between us kept growing. I remember one board dinner in Chicago around 2008. A potential investor asked Grant how he managed the company's financial structure during the recession. Grant smiled and answered for 20 minutes straight. He never mentioned my name once. Not once. Even though I'd personally negotiated debt restructuring that kept us alive while 3 competitors went bankrupt. That night in the hotel room, I finally said something. "You could have acknowledged me," I told him quietly while removing my earrings in front of the mirror. Grant loosened his tie and sighed dramatically. "Teagan, not everything has to be about recognition." I turned around slowly. "That's not what I said. You're taking this too personally." I remember the exact feeling that settled in my chest then. Not anger, loneliness, the kind that creeps into marriages long before they officially break. Over the years, Grant became more dismissive every time I questioned him. If I challenged a risky investment, he accused me of being emotional. If I warned him about overspending, he said I lacked vision. If I disagreed publicly, he'd go cold for days afterward. So eventually, I stopped disagreeing publicly. That's how women disappear sometimes, not in one dramatic moment, but piece by piece, silence by silence, compromise by compromise, and the cruelest part, the world rewards you for it. People praised me constantly. "You're so supportive, Teagan. You're the perfect executive wife. Grant couldn't do this without you." But nobody ever asked what it cost me. By our 35th wedding anniversary, Owens Harvest Foods had become worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We owned homes in Ohio and Florida. Grant appeared on business podcasts. Magazines called him a self-made visionary. Self-made. That word used to make me laugh bitterly when no one was around. Because I remembered every unpaid bill, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every terrifying moment when payroll barely cleared. And somewhere deep inside me, I also remembered something else. A conversation with my father years before he died. It happened the winter before Owens Harvest Foods exploded nationally. Dad was already sick by then. He sat in his recliner near the fireplace with a blanket over his knees while snow fell outside. "You love your husband very much," he told me quietly. "I do. But ambition changes men." I hated hearing him say that. "Grant's a good man." Dad nodded slowly. "I think he wants to be." That answer irritated me at the time. Before I left that night, Dad handed me a sealed envelope. "Keep this somewhere safe." "What is it, protection?" I laughed softly, from what his eyes stayed on the fire. "From the day your husband forgets who built his empire." I almost gave the envelope back. I wish now I'd asked more questions. But I was still deeply in love with Grant then. Deeply enough to believe I'd never need protecting from him. After Dad passed away, I locked the envelope inside an old drawer in my office and forgot about it for years. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth. Part of me always knew the day might come. And sitting in that boardroom decades later, hearing my husband call me replaceable in front of strangers, I realized that day had finally arrived. The night of our 35th anniversary party should have felt beautiful. That's what everyone kept telling me. The ballroom at the Lakeside Grand Hotel in Cleveland glittered with crystal chandeliers and white roses. A jazz trio played near the windows overlooking Lake Erie, and waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying champagne on silver trays. To everyone else, Grant and I looked like the perfect American success story. The loyal wife, the powerful husband, the empire they built together. But appearances are dangerous things, especially when you've spent decades helping create them. I stood near the entrance greeting guests, while photographers snapped pictures every few minutes. "Smile, Mrs. Owens. Closer together. One more." Grant's hand rested lightly on my back, but even that felt performative now. Like he was touching a stranger he needed for branding purposes. Madeline noticed it too. I could tell by the way she kept watching us from across the room. At 32, my daughter had inherited my eyes and my habit of noticing things people wished remained hidden. She worked as a pediatric nurse in Columbus and stayed far away from company politics whenever possible. Ethan was different. At 29, he worked inside Owens Harvest Foods as vice president of operations. Grant loved that. He used to brag constantly about passing the business to the next generation. What he really meant was molding Ethan into a younger version of himself. "Mom!" Madeline approached me quietly while adjusting the sleeve of her navy dress. "You okay?" I forced a smile. "Of course." She didn't believe me. Neither did I. Before she could say more, Grant's voice thundered across the ballroom. "There she is, my beautiful wife." Guests turned toward us immediately. Grant loved attention the way some people love oxygen. He walked toward me with his glass raised high, charismatic, and polished in his dark-tailored tuxedo. And beside him walked Sabrina Hale, tall, blonde, elegant, at least 28 years younger than me. Sabrina had joined Owens Harvest Foods 2 years earlier as director of communications, and Grant became unusually enthusiastic about media strategy almost overnight. At first, I ignored the signs. Older women are taught to ignore signs. We're taught dignity means silence. Sabrina smiled warmly at me. "Teagan, the floral arrangements tonight are stunning." "Thank you." Her hand brushed Grant's arm as she laughed softly at something he whispered. Too familiar, too comfortable. I noticed Ethan watching them too, but he quickly looked away. That bothered me more than anything, because it meant this wasn't new. The party continued around us in waves of expensive laughter and polished conversation. Investors praised Grant's latest expansion plans while board members discussed upcoming acquisition opportunities. And through all of it, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching my own life from underwater. An hour later, everyone gathered for dinner. Grant stood near the head table, giving one of his practice speeches. When I started Owens Harvest Foods, he began dramatically, "I had nothing but determination and a dream." I stared down at my wine glass. There it was again. I had nothing. Not we. I. The audience applauded. Grant continued talking about resilience, leadership vision, innovation. All the words successful men love using when invisible women have carried half their weight for decades. Then the conversation shifted toward a new merger deal the company was negotiating with a private investment group out of Chicago. I'd reviewed the preliminary numbers earlier that week. Something about the deal felt wrong. Too rushed. Too aggressive. Too many hidden liabilities. When board member Charles Whitmore mentioned expected expansion profits, I finally spoke. "I still think we should slow down before signing anything," I said carefully. "The debt exposure is higher than it appears." The entire table quieted slightly. Grant smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Teagan worries too much," he said lightly. A few people chuckled politely. I kept my voice calm. "I'm serious, Grant. If market conditions shift even slightly, the company could. We've already gone over this." His tone sharpened. I felt heat rise into my face. "I know, but the numbers still don't make sense." Grant leaned back in his chair slowly. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. "You know," he said to the table, "this is why I always say successful businesses survive because people are adaptable." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at me. "No one here is irreplaceable." A pause. "Not even you, Teagan." The silence afterward felt endless. I could hear silverware clinking somewhere across the ballroom. A glass breaking faintly near the bar. My own heartbeat. Madeline stared at her father in disbelief. Ethan looked frozen. And Sabrina? Sabrina lowered her eyes, pretending discomfort too late to make it believable. I felt every pair of eyes at the table shift toward me, waiting, wondering whether I'd cry, whether I'd argue, whether I'd embarrass myself publicly. Grant knew exactly what he was doing. Powerful men often humiliate quietly at first. Small cuts, tiny public dismissals, enough to shrink you over time. And the worst part? He expected me to absorb it gracefully, like I always had. I set my napkin beside my plate carefully. Then I looked directly at my husband. For one strange second, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Tiny, quick, gone almost immediately. But I saw it, because after 35 years of marriage, I knew Grant better than anyone alive. And deep down, he knew something dangerous too. He knew I was no longer hurt. I was becoming calm. "I think I need some air," I said softly. Then I stood and walked away from the table. No scene, no screaming, no tears. That disappointed him more than anger ever could. I walked through the hotel hallway toward the balcony overlooking the lake. Cold April wind hit my face the second I stepped outside. For the first time all night, I could breathe. A minute later, the balcony door opened behind me. Madeline. "Mom?" I didn't turn around. "You don't have to defend him," I said quietly. "I'm not going to." That surprised me. I finally looked at her. She seemed nervous. More nervous than someone upset over a rude comment. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered. Before she could continue, the balcony door opened again. "Grant." "There you are," he said with irritation hidden beneath forced charm. "People are asking where you went." Madeline immediately went silent. I noticed it instantly. Grant noticed too. His eyes narrowed slightly at our daughter. "What's going on?" "Nothing." Madeline answered too quickly. Grant stepped closer to me. "You're overreacting." I almost laughed. Overreacting. After being humiliated publicly by my husband at our own anniversary dinner. I didn't make a scene. You made things uncomfortable. The irony of that statement nearly took my breath away. Then Sabrina appeared in the doorway. "Grant Charles wants to discuss the Chicago investors." Of course he did. Grant adjusted his jacket immediately. Business first, always. Before leaving, he looked back at me with visible annoyance. "Try not to disappear again tonight." Then he walked away with Sabrina beside him. Madeline stared after them silently. And finally, very quietly, she said the sentence that changed everything. "Mom, I think Dad's planning something." I waited until nearly midnight before going home. Grant stayed behind at the hotel with investors and board members drinking expensive whiskey and pretending everything was normal. Madeline offered to come with me, but I told her no. Not because I wanted to be alone, because I needed silence. Real silence. The kind where painful thoughts finally stop whispering and start speaking clearly. The house felt enormous when I walked inside. Too polished, too cold. Every lamp glowed softly against marble floors and spotless furniture that decorators had chosen years ago. None of it felt like home anymore. I slipped off my heels near the staircase and stood there for a long moment, listening to the emptiness. 35 years. How could 35 years end with a sentence like replaceable? I walked slowly toward the west wing of the house where my old office used to be. Nobody entered that room anymore. Not even me, especially not me. Grant had renovated most of the house over the years, but somehow that room remained untouched. Maybe because he never considered it important enough to notice. Dust floated through faint moonlight as I opened the door. The smell hit me first. Old paper. coffee stains buried in wood, memories. For years, this room had been the nerve center of Owens Harvest Foods, before executive offices, before skyscraper conference rooms, before private jets and media interviews. This was where invoices got paid, where payroll survived, where disasters got fixed quietly before Grant even knew they existed. I ran my fingers across the old desk and felt emotion tighten painfully in my throat. How many nights had I sat here exhausted beyond words while my children slept upstairs? How many times had I solved problems nobody ever thanked me for? I moved toward the filing cabinet near the bookshelf. Bottom drawer, locked, exactly where I'd left it. For a second, I just stared at it, because deep down, opening that drawer meant admitting something I'd avoided for years, that my father had been right. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked it. Inside sat a faded leather folder, several sealed documents, and one cream-colored envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting. Teagan. Seeing his handwriting nearly broke me. Dad had been gone almost 12 years, but grief has strange ways of surviving inside ordinary objects. I sat slowly in the old desk chair and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. Short, direct, exactly like him. Teagan. If you are reading this, then Grant has finally become the man I worried success would turn him into. You are kinder than I ever was, so you'll probably spend years making excuses for him. Do not. You built more of that company than anyone will ever admit. I made certain you would never leave it powerless. Everything you need is in the enclosed documents. Do not let anyone convince you your sacrifices were small. Especially your husband. Love, Dad. By the time I finished reading, tears blurred the page completely. Not dramatic sobbing, not loud grief, just silent tears slipping down my face while decades of denial collapsed quietly inside me. Because he had known. All those years ago, my father had seen something in Grant I refused to see myself. Ambition without gratitude. Power without loyalty. I wiped my eyes and opened the leather folder. Inside were copies of the original Owens Harvest Foods Incorporation papers. My signature appeared first, then Grant's. Not the other way around. I frowned. I honestly hadn't looked at these documents in decades. Back then, none of this felt important. We were just trying to survive. But now every detail mattered. I continued reading carefully. Then my breath caught. There it was. A special voting clause attached to my founder shares. Golden voting authority. I stared at the paragraph in disbelief. In the event of executive misconduct, breach of fiduciary responsibility, fraudulent activity, or actions deemed harmful to the long-term stability of the company, founder Teagan Owens retains emergency authority to call a board review and override executive leadership pending majority confirmation. My father hadn't just protected me financially. He had protected my power. I leaned back slowly in the chair, stunned. Grant never mentioned this, not once, which meant one of two things. Either he forgot it existed, or he'd spent years hoping I never remembered. A cold realization settled over me. Grant had been preparing something. Madeline's expression earlier suddenly replayed in my head. Mom, I think Dad's planning something. I opened another file. Internal stock structure reports, ownership breakdowns, old legal correspondence. Then I found something even stranger. A letter from Harriet Monroe. I hadn't heard that name in years. Harriet was my father's attorney. Sharp-minded, ruthless in negotiations. The kind of woman powerful men underestimated exactly once. The document was dated 11 years earlier. Teagan, At your father's request, I am reminding you that your founder protections remain fully enforceable under Ohio corporate law, despite later executive restructuring attempts. Any effort to remove or diminish those protections without your direct written authorization would be invalid. Please contact me immediately if circumstances ever require enforcement. I lowered the paper slowly. Executive restructuring attempts. My stomach tightened instantly. Grant tried to remove my protections. At some point during our marriage, my husband quietly attempted to strip me of my authority inside the company I helped build. And he never told me. The room suddenly felt colder. I stood up and walked toward the window, my pulse pounding hard now. Outside rain had started falling over the dark lawn. How long had this been happening? How many meetings? How many conversations behind closed doors? How many times had Grant smiled at me across dinner tables while secretly trying to erase me from the company's foundation? The humiliation from earlier no longer felt isolated. It felt strategic, calculated, deliberate. My eyes drifted toward an old framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf. Grant and me in our 20s, standing inside the original warehouse. We looked exhausted and hopeful and deeply in love. For a dangerous moment, grief overwhelmed everything else. Because losing a marriage isn't just losing a person. It's losing the future you believed you were building together. I picked up the photo frame carefully. "Who did you become?" I whispered. But another voice inside me answered immediately. No, the worst truth was this: who had I allowed him to become? For years, I excused everything: the dismissive comments, the arrogance, the emotional distance, the public disrespect. Because somewhere along the way, I started believing my value came from keeping peace instead of demanding respect. Older women are taught that constantly. Keep the family together. Stay graceful. Don't embarrass your husband. Don't become bitter. So we swallow hurt until it poisons us quietly. But something inside me had changed tonight. Not because Grant humiliated me, because for the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the charming young dreamer I married, not as the father of my children, not even as my husband. I saw him as a man terrified of losing control. And suddenly, I understood why he called me replaceable. Because powerful men only say that to women they fear might finally realize they aren't. I looked down at the documents again. Then slowly, very slowly, I smiled, not with happiness, with clarity. For 35 years, Grant Owens believed he was the face of the empire. Tomorrow morning, he was going to learn who still owned its foundation. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around 4 a.m, I gave up trying. Rain still tapped softly against the windows as I sat alone in the kitchen, wrapped in one of my old gray cardigans. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from old wood settling. I kept rereading the documents from the office. Founder protections, emergency voting authority, attempts to remove my control. Every page felt like proof that my marriage had been dying long before I admitted it. At 6:12 a.m. headlights swept across the driveway. Madeline. I already knew it before she stepped inside. A mother always knows the sound of her children arriving upset. She entered quietly, wearing jean sneakers, and yesterday's makeup smudged beneath tired eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "Coffee?" I asked softly. She nodded immediately. Neither of us spoke while I poured it. Some conversations are too heavy to begin quickly. Madeline wrapped both hands around the mug like she needed warmth more than caffeine. "I almost didn't come," she admitted. I sat across from her slowly. But you did. Her eyes filled instantly. And suddenly, for one painful second, she looked 6 years old again instead of 32. Mom, she whispered. I'm so sorry. My chest tightened. For what? For knowing. That word hung between us. Knowing. I stayed very still. Madeline wiped tears from beneath her eyes, angrily embarrassed by them. How long? I asked quietly. She looked down at the coffee. About 8 months. The answer hurt more than I expected. Not because she knew. Because she'd been carrying it alone. What exactly do you know? Madeline inhaled shakily. At first, I just thought Dad was spending too much time with Sabrina. I said nothing. Hearing another woman confirm the affair somehow made it real in a way my instincts never fully allowed. He started bringing her everywhere, Madeline continued. Business dinners, conferences, charity events. Her jaw tightened, and he stopped even pretending to care whether people noticed. I closed my eyes briefly. God, how humiliating must that have been for my children? Ethan noticed too, I asked. Yes. And Madeline hesitated. He doesn't want to believe how bad it is. That sounded exactly like Ethan. My son had inherited my softness instead of Grant's hardness. Even as a child, Ethan avoided conflict so intensely, he'd apologize for things that weren't his fault, just to restore peace. Grant used to call that weakness. I used to call it kindness. They've been planning something, Madeline whispered suddenly. I opened my eyes fully. What do you mean? She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I wasn't snooping intentionally, she said quickly. Dad left his iPad open at the house a few months ago while I was visiting. Her hands trembled slightly. I saw emails. What kind of emails? Madeline looked sick. Emails between Dad, Sabrina, and a law firm in Chicago. My stomach dropped. What law firm? Bennett and Rowe Corporate Strategies. I recognized the name immediately. Aggressive, expensive, known for hostile restructuring cases. Fear spread slowly through my chest. What were they discussing? Madeline swallowed hard. At first it looked like merger paperwork, investment restructuring, leadership transitions. Leadership transitions. Such polite words for betrayal. Then she whispered the sentence that made my blood run cold. They were talking about removing you from company authority permanently. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too airless. I stared at my daughter while memories flashed violently through my mind. Grant dismissing me publicly. Grant shutting me out of meetings. Grant insisting certain legal reviews were already handled. God, this had been happening for a long time. How? I asked, quietly. How were they planning to do that? Madeline looked like she regretted coming now. Mom, tell me. Her eyes filled again. They were building documentation that suggested you were mentally unstable. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes shock sounds exactly like laughter. What they had records of emotional incidents. I don't have emotional incidents. I know that. Madeline leaned forward desperately, but they were twisting things. Private arguments, stress reactions, comments taken out of context. I suddenly remembered 3 different moments over the last year when Grant insisted I was overwhelmed in front of other executives. At the time, I thought he was being patronizing. Now, I realized something much darker. He was laying groundwork. He wanted the board to think you couldn't handle pressure anymore, Madeline whispered. I pressed my fingers against my temple. My own husband, building a narrative that I was unstable, so he could erase me cleanly. The cruelty of it stunned me more than the affair itself. Affairs are selfish. This was strategic. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked softly. Madeline burst into tears instantly. Because I was scared. Her voice cracked painfully. I kept hoping I misunderstood. And every time I tried talking to Dad, he manipulated everything. She covered her face briefly. He said you were exhausted, emotional, that you didn't want responsibility anymore. Classic Grant. Turn concern into control. Turn betrayal into management. I should have told you, she whispered. I know I should have. I reached across the table and took her hand immediately. No. She looked up at me. You're not responsible for your father's choices, but I protected him. No, I said firmly. You protected your family. There's a difference. Madeline cried harder after that. Probably because she needed someone to finally say it out loud. We sat there quietly for several minutes while morning light slowly filled the kitchen. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Is Sabrina really involved with him? Madeline looked miserable. Yes, the simplicity of that answer hurt most. No dramatic explanation, no uncertainty, just yes. I stared out the window at the gray morning sky. You know what's strange? I said quietly. What I think part of me already knew. Madeline said nothing. Women always know, I continued softly. We just spend years convincing ourselves we're imagining things. Because admitting the truth changes everything, and some truths cost too much. I stood and walked toward the sink slowly. You said there were emails, I said carefully. Do you still have access to them? Madeline hesitated. Then she nodded. I saved screenshots. I turned toward her immediately. You what? I didn't know why at the time, she admitted. Something felt wrong. My daughter had protected evidence before I even understood I needed protection. Pride and heartbreak hit me simultaneously. Can I see them? Madeline unlocked her phone silently and handed it over. The first screenshot nearly stopped my breathing. From Grant Owens to Sabrina Hale, C. Bennett, and Roe legal team. Teagan's resistance is becoming more emotional lately. We need to accelerate transition timing before she becomes difficult publicly. Another message read, once competency concerns are formally documented, voting complications should no longer be an issue. Competency concerns. I felt physically sick. There were more. Messages discussing leadership optics, public relations strategy, narrative control. And one line from Sabrina that made my stomach twist violently. People already see her as the aging wife anyway. Aging wife. 35 years reduced to that. I handed the phone back slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Madeline whispered, What are you going to do? I looked toward the hallway leading to my old office, toward the documents hidden inside that locked drawer, toward the founder protections Grant thought I'd forgotten. And for the first time in years, I answered without fear. I'm going to remind your father who built his company. I called Harriet Monroe at 8:17 the next morning. I still remembered her number by heart. Funny how the mind keeps certain things buried for years until survival suddenly digs them back up. She answered on the third ring. This is Harriet. Her voice sounded exactly the same. Sharp, controlled, the kind of voice that once made arrogant executives sit straighter in meetings. Harriet, I said quietly. It's Teagan Owens. A pause. Then, well, she replied calmly. I was beginning to wonder when you'd finally call me. That sentence sent chills through me. She knew. Or maybe women like Harriet always knew how stories like mine eventually ended. An hour later, I drove downtown through gray Cleveland rain toward her office near Superior Avenue. The city looked cold and restless beneath low clouds. Traffic crawled slowly, windshield wipers clicking like a metronome against my thoughts. I barely noticed the drive. My mind kept replaying those emails from Grant and Sabrina. Competency concerns, aging wife, transition timing. It still didn't feel real. Not fully. Part of me kept expecting to wake up beside Grant and discover this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But betrayal becomes impossible to ignore once it finally receives language. Harriet's office occupied the top floor of an old brick building overlooking the river. No flashy corporate signage, no modern glass lobby, just quiet authority. The receptionist greeted me warmly. "Ms. Monroe is expecting you." Of course she was. Harriet had always been the type of woman who expected everything. I found her standing near the windows when I entered. She looked older, of course. White hair now instead of silver. Thinner shoulders. More lines around her mouth. But her eyes remained terrifyingly intelligent. "Teagan." Before I could speak, she crossed the room and hugged me tightly. That nearly broke me. Because sometimes kindness hurts more than cruelty when you've gone too long without it. She pulled back slowly and studied my face. "You finally know, not a question." I nodded once. Harriet sighed softly. "I hoped your father was wrong. So did I." She motioned for me to sit at the large oak conference table. "I assume this concerns Grant." I placed the leather folder and printed screenshots on the table carefully. Harriet adjusted her glasses and began reading silently. The longer she read, the colder her expression became. Finally, she removed her glasses slowly. "That arrogant son of a bitch." Hearing a 73-year-old attorney say that should not have comforted me as much as it did. "He tried to remove my protections," I whispered. "Yes, you knew." Harriet folded her hands carefully. "I knew he attempted corporate restructuring years ago. That would have weakened your authority if executed correctly." "Why didn't you tell me?" Her gaze softened. "Because your father explicitly instructed me not to interfere unless you came willingly." I looked away. "He thought I wouldn't believe him." "No," Harriet said quietly. "He thought you loved your husband enough to ignore warning signs until it became unavoidable. That hurt because it was true." Harriet opened one of the legal documents again. "Grant underestimated something very important." "What you?" I almost laughed bitterly. "He doesn't seem particularly intimidated lately." "Oh, Teagan." Harriet leaned back calmly. "Men like your husband only grow this reckless when they think the woman beside them has forgotten her own power." Silence settled briefly. Then Harriet slid one paper toward me. "Your founder protections remain legally enforceable." My pulse quickened. Fully. "What exactly does that mean now?" "It means," Harriet said carefully, "that if you can demonstrate executive misconduct, financial manipulation, breach of fiduciary duty, or actions harmful to company stability, you retain emergency authority to initiate a board review." I stared at her. "And if the board agrees, Grant can be suspended or removed pending formal investigation." Even hearing the words aloud felt surreal. Remove Grant, my husband, the father of my children, the man I once believed I would grow old beside peacefully. Harriet watched me carefully. "You're still hoping there's another explanation." I swallowed hard. "I don't know what I'm hoping." "Yes, you do." Her voice softened slightly. "You're hoping this man still resembles the one you married." That landed too close to the truth. Because despite everything, part of me still remembered the young Grant who kissed my forehead while we unpacked canned vegetables in freezing warehouses at midnight. The young Grant who held my hand during labor. The young Grant who once looked at me like I was the center of his world. Grief flooded me suddenly. "I don't understand when it changed," I whispered. Harriet's expression grew sad. "Power rarely changes people overnight." It reveals them gradually. I look down at the table. He's trying to paint me as mentally unstable. Yes, I saw. My voice shook despite my efforts. How do you do that to someone after 35 years? Harriet answered without hesitation. By valuing control more than love. The simplicity of her answer stunned me. No dramatic explanation. No complicated psychology. Just truth. Harriet opened another folder from her briefcase. I did some digging after your voicemail this morning. You already investigated. She gave me a dry look. Teagan. I'm old, not dead. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. She slid several documents toward me. Grant has been quietly restructuring executive influence for nearly 3 years. I scanned the pages quickly. Board alignment reports, voting influence summaries, leadership succession planning, and Sabrina's name appeared repeatedly. She's deeper involved than I realized, I murmured. Yes. Harriet's tone sharpened. Your husband has been positioning Sabrina Hale internally as a future executive authority figure. Pain stabbed through my chest again. Not just an affair, replacement, professional, personal, total. Harriet continued. He also attempted to move several founder-level authorities into revised executive structures last year. But he couldn't, numbered why she pointed directly at my father's original legal framework. Because Walter Bennett anticipated exactly this possibility. I stared at the old signatures again. Dad really had protected me, all these years, even after death. Harriet leaned forward. Listen carefully now, Teagan. Her tone changed completely. Businesslike, focused. This situation is no longer emotional. You understand that I hesitated? No, she corrected firmly. You need to understand it. She tapped the screenshots. Your husband is preparing corporate removal strategies. Another tap. He is coordinating narrative management regarding your mental competency. Another tap. And he appears financially entangled with a subordinate executive while negotiating high-risk structural deals. I felt sick again. Harriet's eyes locked onto mine. If you hesitate because you still want to protect him, he will destroy your authority before you realize how far he's willing to go. Silence. Heavy silence. Then I asked the question haunting me most. What if I lose? Harriet answered instantly. You already lose if you do nothing. That hit hard because I knew she was right. I'd already spent years shrinking myself to preserve peace. And where had that peace led me? Public humiliation, betrayal, erasure. Harriet stood and walked toward the windows overlooking downtown Cleveland. You know what your problem is? She asked quietly. I almost laughed. Only one. She turned toward me. You still think protecting everyone else makes you good? I frowned slightly. Doesn't it? No. Her voice cut through the room cleanly. Sometimes it simply makes you convenient for selfish people. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. Painfully deep. Because I suddenly realized how much of my life had been spent making myself smaller so others could remain comfortable. Grant, the company, the family, everyone. Except me. Harriet returned to the table and handed me a business card. On the back, she'd written one sentence, Emergency Board Procedure Timeline. Then she looked directly into my eyes. If you choose this path, there's no returning to the marriage you had before. I stared at the card for a long moment, then finally whispered the truth aloud. I don't think that marriage exists anymore. 3 days later, Grant scheduled the board meeting. He called it an executive growth strategy session. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Men like Grant always hide knives behind polished language. The meeting was set for Thursday morning at Owens Harvest Foods headquarters downtown. Officially, the agenda involved discussing future expansion, investor integration, and leadership modernization. Leadership modernization. Translation replaced Teagan quietly. By then, Harriet and I had already prepared everything: legal documentation, founder protection clauses, financial irregularity reports, copies of internal emails, emergency board activation procedures. The paperwork sat inside 2 dark leather binders in Harriet's office like loaded weapons waiting for the right moment. And despite all of it, I was terrified. Not because I doubted the evidence, because I understood exactly what was about to happen. Once I walked into that boardroom, my marriage would effectively end in public. No more denial, no more pretending, no more protecting Grant from consequences. I barely saw him during those 3 days beforehand. He came home late each night, smelling faintly of whiskey and expensive cologne. We moved around each other like strangers trapped inside a museum version of a marriage. Cold, careful, artificial. The strangest part, Grant seemed almost relaxed. That frightened me most. He thought he had already won. On Wednesday evening, Ethan came by unexpectedly. I found him standing in the kitchen after work, staring at nothing while loosening his tie. He looked exhausted. "You okay?" I asked softly. He forced a smile that looked painfully like mine. "Yeah, a lie." I poured him coffee anyway. My son had inherited his father's height, but not his confidence. Ethan always carried tension visibly, like he'd spent his entire life trying to avoid disappointing everyone at once. "How's work?" I asked carefully. He laughed once under his breath. "That depends who you ask." I stayed quiet. Eventually, Ethan looked at me directly. "Something's happening tomorrow, isn't it?" There it was. I wondered how long he'd sensed the pressure building underneath the company lately. "A board meeting," I answered. "That's not what I mean." His voice dropped lower. "Dad's nervous." That surprised me. Grant seems confident to me. He's pretending. Ethan stared into his coffee. He's been locking himself in his office for hours lately, snapping at everyone, micromanaging things he normally ignores. Fear crept slowly through my chest. Grant knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough to feel threatened. "Has he said anything to you?" I asked. Ethan hesitated too long. My stomach tightened instantly. Ethan. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. He asked where my loyalty stands. The room went silent. What exactly did he say? He said companies fall apart when families stop standing together. Classic Grant. Manipulation disguised as wisdom. "And what did you tell him?" Ethan looked miserable. I didn't answer. Part of me wanted to protect him from what was coming. Another part understood that shielding children from truth only teaches them to tolerate dysfunction longer. So instead, I asked softly, "What do you think is happening?" Ethan looked away immediately. "That's the problem," he admitted quietly. "I think I know." My heart broke a little hearing that. Because children always know more than parents realize, even grown children. "He's still your father," I said carefully. Ethan gave a hollow laugh. "And you're still my mother." Neither of us knew what to say after that. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For several minutes, I simply lay still, staring at the ceiling, while anxiety moved through my body like electricity. This was it, the point of no return. I dressed slowly in a charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn in years. Simple pearl earrings, minimal makeup, nothing dramatic. I didn't want revenge to walk into that boardroom. I wanted authority. Downstairs, I found Grant already in the kitchen reading emails on his tablet. He glanced up briefly when I entered. "You're dressed early. So are you." His jaw tightened slightly. Neither of us mentioned the meeting. Neither of us mentioned the marriage collapsing silently between us. Grant stood and grabbed his car keys. "We may be late tonight," he said casually. "Big discussions ahead." "We..." The word almost made me sick now. He walked toward the door, then paused. "You know," he said, without looking at me, "you should probably stay out of today's meeting." There it was. I kept my voice calm. "Why, it'll get technical." Technical. After decades running the company's financial structure, I almost admired the arrogance. "You think I wouldn't understand it?" Grant sighed dramatically. "That's not what I said. But it was. It always was." I stepped closer slowly. "Then what are you saying?" For a brief moment, irritation flashed openly across his face. "I'm saying things are changing, Teagan." There was something cold in his voice now, something final. I suddenly realized he expected me to step aside quietly, smile gracefully, fade away politely, like aging women are trained to do. Grant looked at his watch. "I have to go." Then he kissed my cheek mechanically and walked out the door. I stood frozen in the kitchen long after his car disappeared. Not from heartbreak anymore, from clarity. By 8:45 a.m., Harriet and I arrived at Owens Harvest Foods headquarters together. The lobby buzzed with its usual polished corporate energy. Employees hurried between elevators carrying laptops and coffee while digital screens displayed company stock information across the walls. The empire. Our empire. No, mine too. I noticed the receptionist's eyes widen slightly when she saw Harriet beside me. News traveled fast inside companies. Fear traveled faster. "You ready?" Harriet asked quietly as the elevator doors opened. "No," I answered honestly. She nodded once. "Good. Only idiots walk into war feeling comfortable." The boardroom occupied the top floor corner overlooking downtown Cleveland. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported walnut table. Grant's favorite kingdom. Voices drifted from inside before we entered. Board members already seated. Investors talking softly. Someone laughing. Then Sabrina's voice. Light. Confident. Like she already belonged there. Harriet glanced at me once. "You don't owe anyone softness today." I inhaled slowly, then pushed open the boardroom doors. The room fell silent instantly. Every head turned toward us. Grant's expression changed first. Confusion, then irritation, then something far more dangerous. Fear. Real fear. Because he saw the binders in Harriet's hands. Sabrina sat beside him, wearing a cream-colored suit and carefully composed confidence. But the second she saw me, her posture stiffened visibly. "Good." Board member Daniel Mercer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Teagan," he said cautiously. "We weren't expecting you." "I know," I replied calmly. Grant stood slowly. "This meeting is executive level." Harriet spoke before I could. "My client remains founder-level authority under Owens Harvest Foods corporate structure." Silence. Absolute silence. Grant's face lost color. For the first time in 35 years, my husband looked genuinely unprepared. He recovered quickly, of course. Men like Grant always do. "This isn't the place for theatrics," he said sharply. I met his eyes evenly. "No," I answered softly. "It's the place for truth." Then I walked toward the head of the table, toward the seat beside my husband, and for the first time in years, Grant Owens moved aside for me. Nobody spoke for several seconds after I sat down. The silence inside the boardroom felt dense enough to touch. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows downtown, Cleveland moved normally beneath gray morning clouds. Cars crawled through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee and umbrellas. Inside that room, however, everything had stopped. Grant remained standing beside his chair, jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Sabrina stared at Harriet's binders like they contained explosives, and the board members? God. Some looked uncomfortable, some confused. A few suddenly looked very interested in the legal documents sitting in front of me. Grant recovered first. Of course he did. Men who spend decades in power become experts at performing calm, while panic burns underneath. This meeting, he said carefully, was intended to focus on company expansion strategy. Harriet folded her hands. And it still can, she replied smoothly, once governance concerns are addressed. Grant's eyes hardened instantly. What governance concerns? I opened the leather folder slowly. For years, I would have trembled in moments like this. Not anymore. Before we discuss expansion, I said calmly, the board deserves clarity regarding executive conduct and leadership integrity. Charles Whitmore frowned immediately. Teagan, what exactly is this about? Grant laughed softly, the kind of laugh meant to make someone seem irrational before they even speak. I think my wife is feeling emotional after our anniversary dinner. There it was, the first attempt. Discredit me emotionally before facts entered the room. And for the first time in our marriage, I refused to absorb it quietly. No, I answered evenly. I think I finally stopped being silent. The room shifted slightly after that. Tiny change, but important. Grant slowly sat down again. Teagan, he said with forced patience, this isn't appropriate. What isn't appropriate, I replied, is attempting to remove a company founder through manipulated competency claims. Silence exploded across the table. Sabrina visibly froze. Daniel Mercer looked sharply toward Grant. What competency claims? He asked slowly. Grant immediately leaned back with exaggerated disbelief. This is ridiculous. Harriet slid printed emails across the table. Is it? The sound of paper moving across polished wood seemed unnaturally loud. Board members began reading, one by one, and I watched their faces change. Confusion first, then concern, then something much more dangerous for Grant. Recognition. Because powerful people know exactly how corporate manipulation works when they see it documented clearly. Charles adjusted his glasses. These emails are authentic, Grant answered immediately. They're taken out of context. Classic response, not fake, out of context. Harriet spoke calmly. The metadata has already been verified. Grant's expression darkened. How exactly did you obtain private executive correspondence? Madeline's face flashed briefly in my mind. I kept my answer simple. The same way most betrayals eventually surface. Carelessness. That hit him harder than I expected. Because Grant suddenly understood something. Someone close to him no longer trusted him. Sabrina finally spoke. This is absurd. Her voice sounded sharp now. Defensive. Strategic succession planning isn't illegal. No, Harriet agreed calmly. But constructing false mental competency narratives against a founder while concealing executive misconduct becomes significantly more problematic. Sabrina's face lost color instantly. Good. For 2 years, that woman smiled politely at me while helping dismantle my life behind closed doors. Now she finally looked uncomfortable. Grant straightened in his chair. Enough. The room quieted again. This is clearly personal retaliation disguised as governance concern. I almost smiled. Retaliation? Amazing how quickly truth becomes revenge when powerful men lose control of the narrative. You called me replaceable in front of this board? I said quietly. Grant shrugged coldly. Because no one is irreplaceable. There's a difference, I answered, between leadership transition and calculated erasure. His jaw tightened. You're dramatizing this. No, I said softly. I'm documenting it. That landed. I could feel the room turning now. Not fully, but enough. Daniel Mercer cleared his throat. Grant, were you preparing leadership restructuring involving Teagan's founder authority? Grant's answer came too quickly. Standard modernization reviews happen constantly. Harriet opened another document. Then perhaps you can explain why external legal counsel discussed removing voting complications through competency documentation. Silence again. Grant's eyes flicked briefly toward Sabrina. Tiny movement, but everyone saw it. Board member Ellen Brooks slowly lowered the papers in front of her. Grant, she said carefully. Is there any truth to these allegations? I watched my husband closely then, not as a wife, as an observer. And suddenly I saw the real Grant more clearly than ever before. Not confident. Cornered. His calm wasn't strength anymore. It was calculation. How long have all of you known me? He asked the room dramatically. Classic pivot. Avoid the facts. Redirect toward emotion and loyalty. I built this company from nothing. No, we again. I've spent 35 years protecting Owens Harvest Foods. Protecting. Interesting choice of word for a man secretly planning corporate betrayal. Then Grant looked directly at me. And suddenly, my wife walks in with conspiracy theories because she feels sidelined. There it was again. Emotional woman. Jealous wife. Aging insecurity. I recognized the strategy instantly now because Harriet had prepared me for it. Destroy credibility before evidence settles. I leaned forward slowly. You transferred company resources through discretionary executive channels tied to Sabrina Hale. Grant rolled his eyes dramatically. Sabrina runs communications. You also concealed debt exposure inside the Chicago expansion framework. That's not true. And you attempted to neutralize founder voting protections through competency narrative preparation. Grant's voice rose slightly. Because you've become impossible to reason with lately? I stared at him for a long moment, then quietly asked, when exactly did respecting myself become unreasonable to you? That shut him up for the first time. Real silence. No performance, no immediate manipulation. Just silence. Because he didn't have an answer. Sabrina suddenly pushed her chair back slightly. This is becoming inappropriate. Harriet turned toward her calmly. You're welcome to leave if executive misconduct discussions make you uncomfortable. The insult landed perfectly. Sabrina's cheeks flushed instantly. Grant snapped. Don't speak to her like that. The room noticed. Everyone noticed. Too protective? Too fast. Daniel Mercer slowly removed his glasses. Grant, he said carefully, are you involved romantically with Ms. Hale? There it was. The question nobody wanted asked out loud. Grant laughed again. But this time, the confidence sounded forced. My personal life has nothing to do with corporate governance. Wrong answer. Everyone in that room knew it. Because relationships inside executive power structures absolutely affect governance. Especially hidden ones. Especially during financial restructuring. Ellen Brooks looked deeply uncomfortable now. Grant, I'm not discussing this. Harriet slid another paper across the table. What about unauthorized executive transfers connected to discretionary accounts? Grant's face changed instantly. There, fear, real fear this time, because, unlike the affair, financial misconduct carried consequences far beyond embarrassment. Those were approved internally. By whom? Harriet asked. No answer. My heartbeat pounded hard now. We were getting close. Very close. Grant suddenly stood again. This meeting is over. No, I said quietly. Every eye turned toward me, and for the first time in years, I felt no fear speaking inside that room. No shrinking, no apologizing, nothing, just clarity. I opened the final section of the founder documents, then placed them directly in front of the board. As acting founder authority under emergency governance protections established during company incorporation, I said steadily, I am formally requesting immediate executive review proceedings regarding CEO misconduct, fiduciary breach concerns, financial concealment, and attempted governance manipulation. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even Grant looked stunned for one brief second. Because suddenly, this wasn't marital conflict anymore. It was corporate war. Charles Whitmore looked pale. Teagan, are you invoking emergency authority? Yes. Grant slammed both hands against the table. This is insane. I met his eyes calmly. No. Then I said the sentence I'd waited 35 years to finally speak aloud. This company would not exist without me. And for the first time since entering that boardroom, nobody looked at Grant. They looked at me. The room stayed frozen after my statement. This company would not exist without me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. After years of silence, the truth sounded loud enough on its own. Grant stared at me like he no longer recognized the woman sitting beside him. Maybe he didn't, because the version of me he depended on for 35 years was gone now. The accommodating wife, the woman who softened herself so everyone else could stay comfortable. She died the moment he called me replaceable. Daniel Mercer finally cleared his throat. As acting founder authority, he said carefully, Teagan is within her legal rights to request executive review proceedings. Grant turned sharply toward him. You can't seriously be entertaining this. Daniel didn't flinch. I'm entertaining documented evidence. The difference mattered. Grant looked around the room, searching for loyalty, for rescue, for control. But power becomes fragile the second fear enters the room. And fear was everywhere now. Charles Whitmore rubbed his forehead slowly. If these allegations are accurate, we have a fiduciary obligation to investigate. Grant laughed bitterly. Oh, come on. He pointed toward me. She's emotional because our marriage is having problems. There it was again. Reduce the woman to emotion. Reduce the facts to marital drama. But this time, nobody rushed to comfort him. Nobody nodded automatically, because the documents sitting in front of them were too specific, too dangerous. Harriet remained calm. The board can either proceed formally, she said, or explain later why credible governance concerns were ignored. That landed hard, especially with people whose reputations depended on appearing responsible. Grant suddenly turned toward Ethan. Say something. My son visibly tensed. God, I hated this part. More than the affair, more than the humiliation. Because now the children stood directly inside the collapse of our marriage. Ethan looked between us carefully. Dad. No, Grant snapped. I want to know where you stand. The room became painfully quiet again. I could almost feel Ethan's panic. He hated conflict, always had. When he was 10 years old, he once cried for an hour after accidentally breaking a neighbor's garden light because he couldn't bear disappointing anyone. And now his father was forcing him to choose sides inside a corporate war. I wanted to save him from that. But there was no saving anyone anymore. Only truth. Ethan swallowed hard. I don't think this should be happening in front of everybody. Grant scoffed. Funny, nobody cared about privacy when your mother started this circus. I watched Ethan carefully then, the flicker of hurt in his face, the tightening jaw, the exhaustion. Maybe for the first time in his life, my son finally saw what I'd lived with for years. Not just arrogance, cruelty. Dad, Ethan said quietly, the emails are real. Grant's expression darkened instantly. You don't know the full context. Then explain it. That surprised everyone, especially Grant, because Ethan almost never challenged him directly. Grant leaned back slowly. This company is evolving. There was that word again. evolving, as if betrayal sounded more sophisticated wrapped in corporate language. We needed stronger leadership structures, he continued. Teagan became increasingly resistant to change. I almost laughed. Resistant to change. Translation? I stopped agreeing blindly. Grant looked directly at Ethan. You work inside this company? You know how demanding modern leadership is? Ethan stayed silent. Grant pressed harder. Do you honestly think your mother could handle the pressure of what's coming next? There it was. Not subtle anymore. Public humiliation disguised as concern. I felt something inside me finally snap completely then. Not emotionally, cleanly, like a final thread breaking, because after 35 years, this man truly believed I was weak. Not because I lacked intelligence, because I chose kindness too often. I looked at Ethan gently. You don't owe either of us loyalty over truth. Grant turned toward me sharply. Don't manipulate him. I stared at my husband in disbelief. Manipulate? After months, maybe years of secretly building competency accusations against me, the hypocrisy would have been laughable if it wasn't so ugly. Harriet slid another document across the table. Additional financial concerns were uncovered this morning. Grant's face hardened immediately. What financial concerns? Discretionary transfers tied to executive authorization channels. Grant looked furious now. Those were approved investments. Harriet's voice remained calm. Then you should have no issue explaining why they bypassed standard board disclosure. No answer. Just silence. The dangerous kind. Ellen Brooks slowly looked up from the paperwork. Grant, did company funds support unauthorized outside projects? No, too fast. Too defensive. Daniel Mercer folded his hands. Then why are there missing disclosures? Grant's composure finally cracked slightly. Because I'm the CEO. I don't need permission to make operational decisions. That sentence changed the room. I saw it happen, not dramatically, but clearly. Board members stopped looking at him like a visionary leader. They started looking at him like a liability, and men like Grant feel that shift instantly. He stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Nobody answered. That silence frightened him more than arguments would have. Then he looked directly at Ethan again. Tell them, he demanded. Tell them what kind of pressure your mother's been under lately. My heart dropped. Grant was actually trying to use our son to support the mental instability narrative. Even now. Even here. Ethan looked horrified. Dad? She barely sleeps. She's emotional. She overreacts to everything lately. I finally spoke. You mean after discovering my husband was planning to erase me from my own company? Grant ignored me completely. She's overwhelmed. And suddenly, Ethan exploded. No, he snapped. The entire room froze. Because Ethan never snapped. Ever. My son stood slowly from his chair, breathing hard. No, he repeated louder. Mom's not overwhelmed. She's been carrying this company longer than most people in this room. Grant stared at him in shock. Ethan's voice shook now, but he kept going. You know how many times she fixed problems before anybody else even noticed them, Ethan? No. My son looked directly at his father. You keep talking like you built everything yourself. Grant's face darkened dangerously. Watch your tone. But Ethan didn't stop. Mom stayed awake nights handling payroll when we were kids. She practically ran operations alone half the time. The room listened carefully now. Not to executives, not to lawyers, to family, which somehow made the truth heavier. Ethan swallowed hard. You taught me leadership meant protecting people, he told Grant quietly. But this? His voice cracked slightly. This isn't leadership. For the first time since entering the boardroom, I saw genuine panic cross Grant's face. Because he was losing something more important than authority. He was losing control of the story. And once powerful men lose narrative, control collapse usually follows. Daniel Mercer inhaled slowly. I think we need to proceed with formal review voting. Grant slammed his palm against the table. You're making a catastrophic mistake. Harriet answered calmly. No. We're responding to one. Charles Whitmore looked physically ill now. Procedurally, he said carefully, we need a board vote regarding temporary executive suspension pending investigation. The words hit the room like thunder. Temporary executive suspension. Grant looked at every person sitting there one by one, searching for loyalty, for fear, for weakness. Then finally, his eyes landed on Ethan. My son looked devastated, but steady, and suddenly I realized something heartbreaking. Ethan wasn't choosing between parents today. He was choosing between truth and fear. Grant's voice softened slightly. Son, he said quietly, family stands together. God, that almost broke me, because part of Ethan still desperately wanted his father to be good. I could see it in his eyes. The child inside him still begging for the man he admired growing up. I wanted to rescue him from that impossible pain. But before I could speak, Ethan looked at me, then at Grant, and finally whispered, family shouldn't destroy each other. Silence. Deep silence. Then Daniel placed the voting documents onto the table. One by one, board members reached for their pens. And suddenly, everything came down to votes. The voting took less than 3 minutes. It felt like the longest 3 minutes of my life. Nobody spoke while the board members marked their decisions. Rain streaked slowly across the glass windows behind us, blurring the Cleveland skyline into gray shadows. Somewhere far below, traffic horns echoed faintly through downtown streets. Inside the boardroom, all I could hear was breathing, pens moving, paper shifting, and my own heartbeat. Grant stood near the far end of the table now instead of sitting. He looked furious, but controlled like a man desperately holding himself together through force alone. Sabrina wouldn't even look at me anymore. Good. For once, discomfort belonged to somebody else. Daniel Mercer collected the voting sheets carefully, while Harriet remained calm beside me. I envied her composure. Because despite everything, I still felt sick. Not uncertain, just heartbroken. People imagine revenge feels powerful. But when the person collapsing in front of you is someone you once loved deeply, there's nothing satisfying about it. Only grief. Daniel finished counting silently. Then he inhaled slowly. The board has reached a majority decision. Nobody moved. Grant's jaw tightened visibly. Daniel looked directly at him. Pending formal investigation into governance misconduct, fiduciary concerns, and executive disclosure irregularities. The board votes to temporarily suspend Grant Owens from CEO authority, effective immediately. The words landed like a bomb. Even after everything, hearing them aloud stunned me. Grant stared at Daniel in disbelief, then at the others, then finally at me. And for the first time in 35 years, my husband looked powerless. This is insanity, he said quietly. Nobody answered, because what could anyone say? The empire he controlled for decades had just slipped from his hands in less than an hour. Ellen Brooks looked physically shaken. Grant, maybe it's best if you step back temporarily until legal review finishes. Grant laughed bitterly. Step back. His voice rose sharply. You people wouldn't even be sitting in this building without me. There it was again. Me, not us. Never us. Daniel remained composed. This decision is temporary pending investigation. No, Grant snapped. This is a coup. His eyes locked onto mine. You did this. I held his gaze steadily. No, I answered softly. You did. The silence afterward felt brutal. Because deep down, Grant knew it was true. Harriet slid another document toward the board. As founder authority holder Teagan Owens will assume interim executive oversight responsibilities during investigation proceedings, unless the board objects. Nobody objected. Not one person. That hit Grant harder than the suspension itself. Because silence from powerful people is rarely neutral. Silence means survival. And the board had already begun shifting survival away from him. Grant looked around the room again, searching for allies, for loyalty, for someone to stop this. But fear had changed sides now. Finally, his eyes landed on Ethan. My son looked pale, devastated. Grant's voice softened unexpectedly. Ethan. God, that one word carried so much pain. You're just going to let this happen. Ethan looked like he might break apart completely. I wanted to protect him from this conversation, but there was no protecting anyone anymore. Only consequences. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't do this, Dad. Grant laughed once under his breath. That's what you tell yourself. Stop, I said quietly. Grant ignored me. She manipulated all of you. There it was again. The emotional woman manipulating everyone. Funny how men call it manipulation whenever women stop obeying. Sabrina finally stood abruptly. This entire process is legally questionable. Harriet looked almost amused. It's extremely legal, actually. Sabrina grabbed her tablet quickly. Grant, we should leave. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Grant slowly picked up his jacket from the chair. His movements looked strangely older now. Heavier. Like the weight of reality had finally reached him. Before leaving, he looked directly at me. You think this makes you powerful? His voice sounded cold again. Dangerously cold. I answered honestly. No, because this never felt like power. It felt like survival. Grant stepped closer slowly. Careful, Teagan. Harriet immediately stood beside me, but I shook my head slightly. Grant leaned down just enough so only I could hear him clearly. You have no idea what happens next. Then he walked away. Sabrina followed immediately behind him in silence. And just like that, Grant Owens was no longer CEO of Owens Harvest Foods. The room stayed quiet long after the doors closed. I think everyone needed time to absorb what had happened. Daniel finally exhaled heavily. Well, he muttered softly that escalated quickly. Nobody laughed. Harriet closed her binder calmly. We should move fast now. I looked toward her. What do you mean men like Grant don't accept loss quietly? A chill moved through me instantly. Because she was right. Grant wasn't defeated. Not yet. He was cornered. And cornered men become dangerous. The rest of the meeting blurred together after that. Temporary governance discussions, crisis communication planning, legal procedures, emergency operational oversight. At some point, Ellen turned toward me carefully. Teagan, are you prepared to step in immediately? I almost said no. Because emotionally, absolutely not. My marriage had just collapsed publicly in front of executives and lawyers, but emotionally unstable women say no. Women who understand survival say yes. So I answered calmly, I've been prepared for years. The room grew quiet again after that, and suddenly I realized something strange. For decades, these people had underestimated me simply because I stopped demanding visibility. Now they were finally seeing what had always been there. Around noon, the meeting adjourned. Board members left slowly in tense clusters while legal teams remained behind discussing documentation timelines. I stood alone near the windows, staring at the city below, when Ethan approached me quietly. "Mom?" I turned. My son looked exhausted. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" His eyes filled slightly. "I feel like I betrayed him. That nearly broke my heart." I stepped closer immediately. "You told the truth. He's still my father." "I know." Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. I kept thinking maybe this would stop before it got this far. So did I. That was the hardest truth of all. Neither of us wanted destruction. We wanted honesty. But sometimes honesty destroys what was already rotten underneath. Ethan looked toward the boardroom doors, where Grant disappeared earlier. I've never seen him look afraid before. Neither had I. Not truly. And somehow, that frightened me more than his anger. Because men unused to losing control often lash out hardest afterward. Harriet approached us carrying several folders. "We need to discuss immediate security measures." I frowned. Security Grant still has executive access across multiple systems. My stomach tightened instantly. He wouldn't sabotage the company. Harriet looked at me carefully. "You still believe that because you remember the man he used to be?" Pain moved sharply through my chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe part of me still loved a version of Grant that no longer existed. As we walked toward the executive offices, employees throughout the building kept staring at me. Whispers already spreading. Rumors multiplying by the minute. Some faces looked shocked. Some sympathetic. Some afraid. By evening, the news broke publicly. Financial blogs first, then local business media, then national outlets. Grant Owens suspended amid governance investigation. Owens Harvest Foods appoints interim CEO Teagan Owens. My phone started ringing nonstop. Reporters, investors, unknown numbers. Madeline called crying, not from sadness, from shock. "Mom?" she whispered, "You actually did it." I looked around the executive office that used to belong to my husband, then slowly sat down behind the CEO desk for the very first time. No triumph filled me, only exhaustion, and somewhere underneath that exhaustion, fear, because Grant's final words kept replaying inside my mind. "You have no idea what happens next." And deep down, I was beginning to think he meant it. By the third day of being interim CEO, I realized something terrifying. Grant hadn't just prepared for success. He had prepared for war. The first signs appeared quietly. Suppliers calling with nervous questions, investors requesting emergency clarification meetings, financial reporters circling the company like vultures sensing blood, and underneath all of it, a strange instability inside the numbers. At first, I thought it was stress clouding my judgment. I barely slept anymore. My days blurred into endless meetings, legal briefings, media statements, and damage control conversations. Every hallway inside Owens Harvest Foods carried whispers now. Some employees looked relieved when they saw me. Others looked afraid. A few looked openly suspicious. Because that's how these stories always work publicly. A powerful man falls. And somehow, people still wonder whether the woman standing afterward caused the collapse. Thursday night, long after most employees went home, I sat inside the executive office reviewing acquisition files while rain hammered against the windows again. Cleveland seemed permanently gray lately. Harriet stood beside the conference table, reading through contract binders with increasing concern. Finally, she removed her glasses slowly. "Teagan." Something in her voice made my stomach tighten instantly. "What is it?" She turned one document toward me. "Have you fully reviewed the Chicago investment agreement yet?" Not line by line. You need to. I moved beside her. The contract stretched nearly 200 pages filled with corporate language dense enough to bury landmines inside ordinary sentences. Harriet pointed toward a section halfway through the agreement. Read this clause. I scanned quickly, then slower, then again, and suddenly my blood went cold. Termination penalty enforcement. If Owens Harvest Foods initiates executive restructuring, leadership displacement, or transaction disruption following preliminary acceptance, I looked up sharply. The company owes them $82 million. Harriet nodded grimly. If the deal collapses under governance instability conditions, yes. I stared at the contract in disbelief. That would cripple us, possibly destroy you. My pulse pounded hard now. Grant knew this. Of course he knew. He had signed the agreement personally. Suddenly, his final warning replayed again inside my mind. You have no idea what happens next. Oh God, this was the next thing. Grant built a poison contract, a deal designed to explode if he lost control. I sank slowly into the chair beside the conference table. No, I whispered. He wouldn't risk the company itself. Harriet didn't answer immediately. That silence told me enough. Because part of her already believed he would. And maybe part of me did too now. I pressed both hands against my forehead. If this clause activates what happens? Harriet's expression remained careful. Massive investor panic, credit instability, operational collapse risk. How did nobody catch this? They trusted Grant. That answer hurt more than it should have, because I trusted him too. For decades. Harriet sat across from me. You need to understand something clearly now. I looked up slowly. This agreement wasn't written for company growth. The realization hit me before she even finished speaking. It was leverage. Yes. Cold fear spread through my chest. Grant built a trap, not just for the board, for me. If he stayed CEO, the deal moved forward and strengthened his control. If he lost power, the company risked catastrophic penalties. Either way, he remained central. I suddenly understood something horrifying about my husband. This wasn't only ego anymore. It was obsession with control. Harriet opened another folder. There's more. I almost laughed bitterly. Of course there was. There are signature inconsistencies inside several amendment pages. What kind of inconsistencies? Look closely. She slid copies toward me. At first glance, the signatures appeared normal. Mine, except not mine. My breathing stopped. That's not my handwriting. No. I stared at the forged signature in disbelief. Grant had forged my approval on revised executive restructuring amendments. My hands actually trembled now, because this crossed into something darker than manipulation. Criminal. How many documents? I whispered. Possibly 6. I stood abruptly and walked toward the windows, trying to breathe through the panic rising inside me. Below us, Cleveland glowed with wet streetlights and blurred headlights. Normal life continuing while mine disintegrated piece by piece. How long? I asked quietly. We don't know yet. I closed my eyes briefly. 35 years. 35 years beside a man who eventually decided forging my signature was acceptable. A knock interrupted the silence. Ethan stepped inside, looking exhausted. You're still here. I turned slowly. So are you. He gave a tired half smile before noticing Harriet's expression. What happened? Nobody answered immediately. That scared him. Ethan looked between us. Mom? I handed him the forged documents silently. He read them once, then again. His face lost color. No, I'm afraid so. That's impossible. God! Hearing my son defend the impossible broke something inside me. Because children always want limits to their parents' darkness. Ethan stared at the papers longer, then whispered, "He actually forged your signature?" Harriet answered carefully. "We're verifying formally, but yes, it appears that way." Ethan sat down heavily. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then quietly, almost to himself, Ethan said, "I don't even recognize him anymore." Neither did I. Maybe I hadn't for years. Maybe I just refused to admit it. Ethan suddenly looked up. "There's something else." Fear tightened my chest immediately. "What?" He hesitated. "I found irregular retirement fund transfers last month." Harriet straightened instantly. "What kind of transfers?" Ethan rubbed his forehead. "I thought they were accounting timing issues at first." "Ethan." His eyes filled with shame. "There's missing money from employee retirement reserves." The room went completely still. "How much?" Harriet asked carefully. "About 12 million. I physically sat down again because my knees weakened. "No." Ethan looked sick. "I swear I didn't know where it went." Harriet's voice sharpened instantly. "Who approved the transfers?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Dad." The silence afterward felt suffocating. Employee retirement funds, people's futures, their savings. Grant didn't just betray me, he endangered everyone. Suddenly, the entire company felt different in my mind. This wasn't about marriage anymore, not even primarily about power. This was about protection. Employees trusted Owens Harvest Foods with their livelihoods for decades. Families, retirement plans, medical benefits, college savings, and Grant gambled with those lives to maintain control. I looked toward Ethan carefully. "Does anyone else know?" "Not yet." Harriet immediately stood. "We need forensic accounting review tonight." Ethan nodded numbly. As Harriet stepped into the hallway making urgent calls, I looked at my son. He seemed shattered. "I'm sorry," he whispered suddenly, "for what I worked beside him every day and didn't see it." I moved closer slowly. "Yes, you did." He frowned slightly. "You questioned things. You felt uneasy. You noticed changes." Ethan stared down at the forged documents again. I kept making excuses. I almost smiled sadly. So did I. That's the terrible thing about loving someone. You become talented at misunderstanding reality in ways that protect your heart. Ethan's voice dropped lower. "What happens if this goes public?" I looked around the executive office that once belonged to my husband. The expensive furniture, the skyline view, the polished empire. And suddenly, none of it mattered. Because underneath all the appearances, everything was bleeding. "We tell the truth," I answered quietly, "even if it destroys us. Especially then." My phone buzzed suddenly across the desk. Unknown number? I almost ignored it, but something inside me tightened instantly. I answered carefully. "Hello." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Grant's voice came softly through the line. "You should have stayed quiet, Teagan." A chill moved through my entire body. "What do you want?" A pause. "Then you still don't understand how much damage is coming." And before I could answer, he hung up. 3 days later, Sabrina Hale walked into my daughter's apartment carrying a smile that finally slipped too far. That was her mistake. Madeline called me crying 20 minutes afterward. Not loud crying, terrified crying. The kind that instantly tells a mother something is wrong. I left the office immediately. Cleveland traffic crawled endlessly beneath cold spring rain while fear pounded inside my chest. Every red light felt unbearable. By the time I reached Madeline's apartment downtown, Harriet was already there. My daughter opened the door with trembling hands. Her face looked pale, shaken, but underneath the fear, there was something else too. Anger. Real anger. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked clothes. Harriet stood near the dining table reviewing something on Madeline's laptop. "What happened?" I asked immediately. Madeline shut the door quickly behind me. "She came here." "Sabrina," Madeline nodded. "How did she know where you live?" "She's been here before with Dad during charity planning meetings." Of course she had. The thought made my stomach twist violently. My daughter moved toward the kitchen counter and grabbed a glass of water with unsteady hands. "She showed up unannounced this morning." Harriet looked up calmly. "Tell your mother exactly what happened." Madeline inhaled shakily. At first she acted polite. I could picture it perfectly. Sabrina's controlled smile, her careful voice, the performance. She said she was worried about the family. Madeline continued bitterly. Said the media situation was getting ugly. Classic manipulation. Pretend concern first, threats second. What did she want? Madeline laughed once, under her breath. My screenshots. Of course. The emails. The evidence. She said everything had been misunderstood, Madeline whispered. That Dad's career was being destroyed over emotional overreaction. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, even after everything, still trying to reduce truth into female emotion. What else? Harriet asked. Madeline hesitated, then slowly reached into her sweatshirt pocket and pulled out her phone. I recorded the conversation. Silence filled the room. Harriet's eyebrows lifted slightly. I stared at my daughter in shock. You what? Madeline looked nervous suddenly. I don't know. Something felt wrong the second she arrived. God, my daughter inherited more from me than I realized. Instinct, pattern recognition, the quiet ability women develop after years around dangerous personalities. Harriet extended her hand calmly. Play it. Madeline unlocked the recording app, then pressed play. Static filled the room briefly. Then Sabrina's voice emerged clearly, smooth, controlled, artificially sympathetic. Madeline, nobody wants this situation to become uglier than it already is. Madeline's recorded voice sounded smaller than normal. I don't know what you mean. Oh, sweetheart, Sabrina sighed softly. You know exactly what I mean. I felt rage rise immediately hearing her speak to my daughter that way. Condescending. Predatory. The recording continued. Your mother is emotional right now, Sabrina said. Grant was only trying to protect the company. Protect the company. I almost laughed. Then came the next part. The dangerous part. We both know Teagan hasn't been stable lately. Harriet immediately paused the recording. That alone helps establish coordinated narrative construction. Madeline looked sick. There's more. She pressed play again. Sabrina's voice lowered slightly now. If those screenshots become public, your father's entire reputation collapses. Good, I thought coldly. But the recording kept going. And honestly, Sabrina continued, at this point, maybe that's what your mother wants. My daughter's voice shook. My mom doesn't want revenge. Sabrina laughed softly. No woman spends 30 years in someone's shadow without eventually becoming bitter. That sentence hit me harder than it should have. Because somewhere deep down, that's exactly how women like Sabrina see older women. Used up, invisible, jealous, discarded, not people, obstacles. The recording continued another minute. Then suddenly Sabrina's voice changed completely. Sharper, colder. Listen carefully, Madeline. Your mother cannot win this. Harriet leaned forward slightly. Keep going. She's already damaged the company enough, Sabrina snapped on the recording. If Teagan pushes harder, investigators start digging everywhere. My pulse quickened. Everywhere then came the moment that changed everything. Madeline's recorded voice whispered, "What are you afraid they'll find? Silence." 5 long seconds of silence. Then Sabrina exhaled sharply and finally said the words that destroyed whatever remained of Grant's defense. "Your father did what he had to do." The room went still. He protected the company from a weak woman who stopped understanding modern business. My chest tightened painfully. Weak woman. After decades holding everything together. The recording continued. "You think those retirement transfers were Grant's idea alone?" Sabrina said bitterly. "Do you have any idea how much pressure he was under?" Harriet immediately paused the audio again. Her expression changed completely. Cold, focused. "Retirement transfers," she repeated quietly. Madeline nodded shakily. She admitted it. Harriet looked at me carefully. No. She implicated herself. Huge difference. Suddenly, the room felt electrically charged. Because this wasn't suspicion anymore. It was evidence. Real evidence. Against both of them. I sat down slowly at the table, trying to process everything. How long was she involved? Madeline wiped tears from beneath her eyes. "I think longer than we realized." I looked toward Harriet. She practically confessed. "Yes," Harriet replied calmly, "because arrogant people eventually mistake intimidation for intelligence." That sounded exactly right. Sabrina walked into my daughter's apartment believing she still controlled the narrative, believing fear would silence us. Instead, she handed us proof. Madeline suddenly looked terrified again. "Can she sue me for recording her?" Harriet shook her head immediately. "Ohio is a one-party consent state. You were part of the conversation." Relief visibly washed across Madeline's face. Then shame replaced it. "I still feel guilty." I reached across the table instantly. "For what? Tearing our family apart." That sentence broke my heart completely. Because children blame themselves for disasters adults create. Always. I squeezed her hand tightly. "Your father tore this family apart the moment he chose deception over honesty." Madeline started crying again, quietly. Not dramatic tears. Exhausted tears. The kind that come after carrying too much emotional weight too long. I moved beside her immediately and wrapped my arms around my daughter. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then softly against my shoulder, she whispered, "I miss who he used to be." God, that hurt because I missed him too. Or maybe not him, maybe just the illusion of him. Harriet stood near the window reviewing notes silently, then finally turned toward us. "We need to move carefully now." I looked up. "What happens next?" "We continue forensic investigation. And the recording, we preserve it legally." My stomach tightened, and Grant Harriet's expression remained unreadable. He's becoming desperate. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Because desperate men with collapsing reputations often become unpredictable. As if reading my thoughts, Harriet spoke again. "You and Madeline need to be cautious. Do you think he'd actually hurt us?" "No," Harriet answered carefully. "But I think he's spent so many years controlling outcomes that he no longer understands consequences clearly." That might have been the saddest thing anyone said about Grant yet. Not evil, just consumed. Consumed by power, by image, by winning. My phone buzzed suddenly on the table. Unknown number again. I stared at it without answering. Then another message appeared immediately afterward. "This isn't over. No signature, no name." but I knew exactly who sent it. Madeline saw my face change. When I turned the phone toward Harriet silently, she read the message once, then sighed softly. Good. I frowned. Good. Harriet looked directly at me. Because men who panic start making mistakes, and for the first time since this nightmare began. I realized Grant Owens was finally starting to panic. The press conference was scheduled for Monday morning. By then, the story had already exploded nationally. Every business network wanted a headline. Every financial analyst had an opinion. Every gossip site suddenly became interested in the collapse of the perfect executive marriage. Some headlines painted me as a betrayed wife finally fighting back. Others painted me as an aging woman destroying her husband out of revenge. Funny how women are almost never allowed to simply tell the truth. Especially older women. We're either victims or villains. Nothing in between. By sunrise, Monday satellite trucks crowded outside Owens Harvest Foods headquarters. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas in cold Cleveland rain, while camera crews adjusted lighting equipment across the sidewalk. Inside the building, tension felt almost physical. Employees whispered nervously in hallways. Phones rang nonstop. Stock analysts demanded statements. And somewhere beneath all of it, people were scared. Not just about Grant, about the company itself. About mortgages, healthcare, retirement plans, families. That mattered to me more than headlines ever would. At 8:15 a.m., Harriet entered my temporary office carrying the final press statement draft. You don't have to answer personal questions, she reminded me calmly. I know. You especially don't owe anyone details about the affair. I looked out the window toward the reporters gathering outside. That's not what this is about. Harriet studied me carefully. No, she agreed softly. It stopped being about marriage a long time ago. She was right. This wasn't a heartbreak story anymore. It was a responsibility story, a truth story, a survival story. Madeline and Ethan arrived together shortly afterward. Seeing them side by side nearly broke me. Because despite everything, they still showed up. My children looked exhausted from weeks of emotional warfare, but there was strength in them now too. Hard-earned strength. Ethan loosened his tie nervously. There are at least 40 reporters downstairs. Madeline managed a weak smile. Apparently, our family is very entertaining now. Nobody laughed, because pain becomes strangely surreal once strangers turn it into public consumption. I walked toward both of them slowly. You don't have to stand beside me today. Madeline immediately shook her head. Yes, we do. Ethan nodded quietly. That almost made me cry. Not because they defended me, because after all the damage Grant caused, my children still chose honesty. At 8:52 a.m., Harriet's phone buzzed. She glanced down, then her expression hardened instantly. What she looked at me carefully. Grant is here. A cold wave moved through my chest. What he entered the building through the private parking garage. Madeline's face paled. He can't seriously be planning to attend. Harriet's jaw tightened slightly. I think he absolutely is. Of course he was. Grant Owens would never surrender narrative control willingly. Not publicly. Not while cameras existed. I inhaled slowly. Fine. Harriet looked surprised. Teagan. No? I straightened my jacket calmly. I'm done hiding from him. Because that was the truth. For years I adjusted myself emotionally around Grant's moods. His ego, his image, his comfort. No more. At exactly 9 a.m., we walked into the press conference room. Camera flashes exploded immediately. The room buzzed with overlapping voices and shouted questions. Mrs. Owens is the CEO, suspension permanent, were company funds stolen? Did Grant Owens have an affair with Sabrina Hale? Are criminal charges pending? It felt overwhelming for half a second. Then, strangely, everything became calm. Not externally, inside me. Because after weeks of chaos, I finally understood something clearly. I wasn't here to defend myself. I was here to tell the truth. I stepped behind the podium slowly. The Owens Harvest Foods logo glowed across the backdrop behind me. Our company. Still standing. Barely. The room quieted gradually. I looked across dozens of reporters' cameras, microphones, and strangers waiting for spectacle. Then I began. Good morning? My voice sounded steadier than I expected. For the past several weeks, Owens Harvest Foods has faced significant internal instability following serious governance concerns regarding executive conduct and financial oversight. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. I continued calmly. As interim CEO, my responsibility today is not to discuss private marital issues. A ripple moved through the room after that. Good. Let them understand this clearly. This company employs thousands of people across multiple states. Families depend on its stability. Employees trusted leadership to protect both their livelihoods and their futures. I saw several reporters lowering their pens slightly now. Listening differently. Not scandal. Responsibility. An independent forensic review is currently underway regarding executive financial activity disclosure, irregularities, and retirement fund concerns. The room immediately erupted again. Retirement fund concerns. Are you confirming misconduct? Did Grant Owens misuse employee funds? I raised one hand slightly. The room quieted again. I will not discuss incomplete investigations, but I will say this clearly. I paused, then looked directly into the cameras. No individual is more important than the integrity of this company. That sentence mattered. Because for years, Owens Harvest Foods revolved around Grant's personality, his image, his mythology, and maybe that was the problem all along. A reporter near the front raised her hand. Mrs. Owens, many people are asking whether this is ultimately about revenge. There it was. Of course. The question waiting underneath all the others. I looked directly at her. If I wanted revenge, I answered quietly, I would have stayed silent. The room went completely still, because silence would have protected Grant, protected the image, protected the illusion. Even while employees suffered, even while lies multiplied, even while my own existence inside the company disappeared. Another reporter spoke up. Did your husband attempt to remove you from corporate authority? Yes. No hesitation, no shame. Gasps moved softly across the room. And did he attempt to portray you as mentally unstable? My chest tightened briefly. Then I answered anyway. Yes. That one hurt. More than the affair. More than the public humiliation. Because weaponizing someone's emotional health against them is a particular kind of cruelty. Before another question could come, the doors at the back of the room opened, and Grant walked in. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Cameras swung toward him. Reporters erupted into chaos again. Grant looked immaculate as always. Dark suit, perfect tie, controlled posture. But I saw it immediately. The strain beneath the performance. He walked toward the front slowly while security hesitated awkwardly. Then he stopped only a few feet from the podium. Teagan, he said calmly into the microphones. You're making a terrible mistake. The room practically vibrated with tension now. I stared at the man I once loved more than anyone on earth. And suddenly, he looked tired, older, smaller somehow. Not because he lost power, because he lost truth. Grant faced the cameras dramatically. My wife is emotional right now. She's been manipulated by lawyers and opportunists trying to dismantle everything we built together. Together. Interesting how he finally remembered that word publicly. Harriet immediately stepped forward, but I gently stopped her. No, this needed to happen. Grant looked directly at me. You're destroying this family. I felt years of pain settle quietly inside my chest. Then finally answered the truth. No, Grant. My voice stayed soft. You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was disposable. Silence. Absolute silence. Then slowly, I reached into the folder beside the podium and removed the final document, the recorded transcript of Sabrina's confession. I placed it directly in front of the cameras. Would you like me to read the part where your executive partner discusses hiding retirement fund transfers? Grant's face changed instantly. Fear. Real fear. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the entire room finally saw it too. After the press conference, everything collapsed faster than even Harriet predicted. By Wednesday morning, federal investigators formally requested financial documentation from Owens Harvest Foods. By Thursday afternoon, 2 major business magazines published detailed timelines connecting Grant and Sabrina to the retirement fund transfers. And by Friday, Sabrina Hale disappeared completely. No public statements, no interviews, no defense of Grant. Nothing. She resigned through attorneys and vanished from every media conversation overnight. I remember staring at the news alert on my phone while sitting alone in the executive office. Sabrina resigns amid investigation. That was it. 2 years of helping destroy my marriage. Months helping manipulate corporate narratives against me. And in the end, she ran. Funny how quickly people abandon powerful men once the power disappears. But Grant stayed. That surprised me. Part of me expected him to flee into silence too. Instead, he fought harder. Every day, new statements appeared through his legal team accusing the board of overreach and claiming he was the victim of emotional retaliation. But fewer people believed him now, because evidence has weight, and truth eventually exhausts performance. Still, none of that brought me peace. That was the strange part nobody talks about after winning. People imagine justice feels triumphant. It doesn't. Not when the person collapsing used to be the center of your life. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after the press conference, I drove back to the old house alone for the first time since everything exploded publicly. The media had mostly stopped camping outside by then. Rain misted softly across the driveway as I unlocked the front door. Silence greeted me immediately. Heavy silence, the kind large houses develop once love leaves them. I walked slowly through rooms that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The dining room where we hosted holidays. The kitchen where I packed school lunches. The staircase where Grant once carried Madeline after she fell asleep during Christmas movies. Memories lived everywhere here, and somehow, that hurt worse than anger ever could. I found myself standing outside our bedroom for several seconds before opening the door. Grant had already moved most of his things out. Half-empty closets, missing watches, empty dresser drawers, 35 years reduced to vacant space. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. God, how many times had I cried silently here without admitting why? How many nights had I convinced myself emotional loneliness was normal inside long marriages? Women from my generation learned to survive disappointment quietly. We called it maturity. Sometimes it was just abandonment with prettier language. My phone buzzed suddenly. A message from Ethan. Dad wants to see you. I stared at the screen a long moment, then typed back, why 3 dots appeared immediately. He says he needs to talk to you privately. My stomach tightened. I almost refused instantly, but something inside me knew avoiding Grant forever wouldn't heal anything. So 30 minutes later, I drove to a small private restaurant near Lakewood, where Ethan said Grant was waiting. Rain tapped softly against the windows when I entered. Grant sat alone in the far corner booth. For a second, I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone. No expensive performance. No charismatic executive energy. Just exhaustion. Real exhaustion. He stood awkwardly when he saw me. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from him without answering. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Grant looked down at his hands. "I suppose you hate me?" The question sounded strangely sincere, and that confused me more than manipulation ever did, because I expected arrogance, defensiveness, excuses. Not this. "I don't know what I feel anymore," I answered honestly. Grant nodded slowly. I deserve that. Silence settled again. I studied the man across from me carefully. This was the first time in weeks we sat together, without lawyers, reporters, board members, or cameras surrounding us. Just two people at the ruins of a marriage. Grant finally looked up. I never meant for it to go this far. I almost laughed. Because every destructive person says that eventually. As if consequences somehow appeared independently from choices. "You forged my signature." His face tightened immediately. "I was trying to protect the company." "There it is," I whispered. "What?" "The excuse you used for everything." Grant looked wounded by that. "Good. He should have been. I built that company too," I continued quietly. "But somehow protecting it never required destroying you." He looked away first. That mattered. For 35 years, I was always the one looking away first. Not anymore. Grant rubbed his forehead tiredly. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." "No," I answered softly. "I understand exactly, because I carried pressure too. I just didn't become cruel from it." That hit him harder than anger would have, because it was true. Grant suddenly looked older than I'd ever seen him. I was scared he admitted quietly. I frowned slightly. Of what losing relevance? The answer stunned me. Not because it was shocking, because it sounded human, painfully human. Grant stared toward the rain outside the restaurant windows. "You know what happens to men like me?" Eventually, I said nothing. "You spend decades becoming important to people because you're useful, powerful, successful." His voice grew quieter. "And then one day, you realize younger people are already circling your chair." I thought of Sabrina immediately. Young, ambitious, admiring him until admiration became leverage. Grant swallowed hard. I thought if I kept growing the company bigger, faster, nobody could push me aside. I looked at him carefully. "So you pushed me aside first." Tears filled his eyes instantly. Real tears. I wasn't prepared for that. "You were never supposed to get hurt," he whispered. That sentence nearly destroyed me, because after everything, part of him still genuinely believed his intentions mattered more than his actions. I leaned back slowly. "Grant," I said softly, "you called me replaceable." He closed his eyes immediately, like hearing the words aloud physically hurt him now. "I know." "No," I whispered. "I don't think you do." Silence, long silence. Then finally, Grant looked at me again. "They're going to destroy me." There it was. The real reason for this meeting? Fear, not love, not remorse. Fear. He needed something. And eventually, he asked for it. "If you speak publicly in my defense," he said quietly, "people will calm down." I stared at him in disbelief. Even now, even after everything, he still wanted me protecting him, shielding him, saving him. I felt something inside me settle permanently then. Not hatred. Closure. "I won't lie for you," I said softly. Grant's face crumpled slightly. "I'm not asking you to lie." "Yes," I answered. "You are." Tears slipped down his face quietly now, and strangely, I didn't feel victorious watching it, only sad. Sad for the young couple we used to be. Sad for the family we could have remained. Sad for the man Grant might have been if power hadn't consumed him completely. I stood slowly from the table. Grant looked up desperately. "Teagan?" I paused, then said the final truth he needed to hear. "I forgive you enough to stop hating you." Hope flickered briefly across his face. Then I finished. "But not enough to save you from yourself." And this time, I walked away first. 1 year later, I stood in front of a room filled with women over 50, holding resumes in trembling hands. Some had raised children for decades before trying to rebuild careers. Some had survived divorces. Some had lost husbands. Some had simply spent too many years being invisible. And every single one of them looked terrified. I understood that feeling now. The fear of beginning again after an entire lifetime built around someone else. The conference room inside the newly renovated Owens Foundation Center glowed with warm afternoon sunlight. Fresh coffee filled the air while volunteers helped women prepare interview portfolios at nearby tables. Above the stage behind me hung a sign, "The Bennett Initiative, it is never too late to begin again," named after my father, the man who protected me long before I knew I needed saving. I stepped toward the microphone slowly while conversations quieted around the room. For a second, I looked at all those faces and saw pieces of myself everywhere. Women who spent years shrinking. Women who forgot their own value because somebody else benefited from their silence. Women learning how to stand again. "Good afternoon," I said softly. My voice no longer trembled in public. That still surprised me sometimes. When I was younger, I continued, I believed strength meant sacrifice. Several women nodded immediately. I smiled sadly. I thought loving people meant making yourself smaller, so everyone else could shine comfortably. God, how many women were raised that way? How many generations taught us endurance instead of self-worth? I looked around the room carefully, but eventually I said quietly, I learned something painful. Silence settled. If people only value you when you disappear for them, that isn't love. A few women wiped tears from their eyes. I understood why. Because older women carry invisible grief everywhere. Grief for opportunities abandoned, dreams delayed, voices softened too long, and sometimes entire identities sacrificed for families who forgot to notice. After the event ended, dozens of women stayed behind, talking quietly in small groups, while volunteers exchanged contact information and job resources. One woman in her 60s hugged me tightly before leaving. "You made me feel visible again," she whispered. That nearly made me cry, because for most of my life, I didn't feel visible either. Not truly, not even inside my own marriage. Owens Harvest Foods had survived somehow, barely at first. The investigation lasted months. Financial restructuring became brutal. Several board members resigned. The Chicago investment deal collapsed entirely, but Harriet successfully negotiated reduced penalties after exposing the fraudulent executive disclosures. The retirement funds were restored. That mattered most to me. Employees kept their futures, families stayed protected, and slowly, very slowly, the company stabilized again, not because of aggressive expansion, not because of ego, because we rebuilt trust. Turns out trust matters more than charisma in the long run. Funny how nobody teaches that in executive leadership seminars. I officially became permanent CEO 8 months after Grant's suspension. The board vote was unanimous. That part still feels surreal. Not because I doubted my capability, because for so many years, I stopped imagining leadership belonged to me at all. Women do that sometimes. We become so accustomed to supporting foundations that we forget we were capable of standing at the center ourselves. The media eventually lost interest in the scandal. They always do. There's always another public collapse waiting somewhere. Another powerful man falling. Another woman surviving him. But our family. That healing took longer. Real healing always does. Ethan started therapy 3 months after everything happened. I'm proud of him for that. My son spent most of his life trying to earn love through peacekeeping. Watching his father unravel forced him to confront painful truths about masculinity power and emotional silence. One evening, not long before Christmas, Ethan came to my house carrying takeout containers and looking unusually nervous. "What's wrong?" I asked while setting plates on the kitchen counter. He laughed softly. "You always know. Mothers usually do." For a moment, he looked very young again. Then quietly he said, "I owe you an apology." I frowned slightly. For what? For believing him too often. That hurt, not because he said it, because I knew exactly what he meant. Ethan looked down at his hands. "Dad spent years acting like you were softer, less capable, emotional." He swallowed hard, and I think part of me absorbed that without realizing it. I walked toward him slowly. "You were raised inside that environment." Still. Tears filled his eyes unexpectedly. "You deserved better from both of us." I hugged my son immediately. "No," I whispered against his shoulder. "You were our child. None of this was your responsibility." But I understood his guilt. Children blame themselves for the emotional architecture of broken families. Always. Madeline healed differently, stronger, sharper somehow. The experience changed her permanently, but maybe not badly. She stopped apologizing so much, stopped shrinking herself, stopped dating men who confused control with confidence. One afternoon, while helping me organize foundation paperwork, she looked up suddenly and said, "You know what's strange? What I think this whole thing saved us." I stared at her. "Our family." She nodded slowly. "Not the version we pretended to be. The real one." That stayed with me, because maybe she was right. Maybe truth destroys illusions so something healthier can finally exist underneath. As for Grant, I hear things occasionally. He moved to Arizona after settlement negotiations ended. Smaller house, quieter life. No more magazine covers. No more executive speeches. Sometimes he emails Ethan. Rarely me. The last message he sent arrived 6 months ago. Only one sentence. I never understood how lonely power made me until I lost it. I stared at that email a very long time before deleting it. Not because I hated him. Because some grief no longer needs reopening. And maybe that's what healing actually is. Not forgetting, not excusing, not pretending pain never happened. Just reaching the point where someone else's destruction no longer controls your future. Tonight, as I lock the foundation office and step outside into cool Cleveland air, I think back to that moment in the boardroom when Grant called me replaceable. At the time, those words nearly destroyed me. Now I almost feel grateful for them, because sometimes the sentence meant to diminish you becomes the one that finally wakes you up. I spent decades believing my value depended on how well I supported everyone else. But I know better now. The woman they called replaceable was the woman holding everything together all along. If this story touched your heart in any way, I'd truly love to hear from you. Have you ever spent years making yourself smaller for someone who stopped appreciating your worth? And if you could say one thing to the younger version of yourself, what would it be? Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Reading your stories reminds me that none of us are ever as alone as we think we are.